The commitment extraction trap. The commitment extraction trap. In August 1858, in the Illinois town of Freeport, Abraham Lincoln stood on a wooden platform in front of an audience of about 15,000 people and asked Stephen Douglas a question. The question had 4 parts. It was carefully constructed. Lincoln had written it the night before, alone in his hotel room, after his advisors had told him that asking it would cost him the Senate seat he was contesting. Lincoln had thanked them for their advice and asked the question anyway. The question was, can the people of a United States territory, in any lawful way, against the wish of any citizen of the United States, exclude slavery from its limits prior to the formation of a state constitution? This sounds, in 2026, like a procedural question of antebellum American political philosophy. It was, in 1858, a trap of unusual elegance. 2 existing positions were available to Douglas, and neither was survivable. The first available position, yes, the people of a territory can exclude slavery, was the one Douglas had been articulating for several years under the doctrine of popular sovereignty. Saying yes preserved his reputation in the northern states, where popular sovereignty was the only acceptable position on slavery. It also, by 1858, contradicted the Supreme Court's recent decision in Dred Scott, which had ruled that the federal Constitution protected the slaveholder's right to take property, including human property, into any territory regardless of local law. Saying yes meant Douglas was rejecting the Supreme Court. Saying yes would lose him the South in the 1860 presidential election he intended to contest. The second available position, no, the people of a territory cannot exclude slavery, would have made Douglas consistent with Dred Scott and would have preserved the South. It would also have abandoned popular sovereignty, the doctrine on which Douglas's entire political career rested, and it would have lost him Illinois and the Senate seat he was currently contesting. Douglas could not say yes without losing the presidency. He could not say no without losing the Senate. The question, as Lincoln had written it, had no third answer. Douglas chose to lose the presidency in order to win the Senate. He answered yes. He won the 1858 Illinois Senate race against Lincoln. He lost the 1860 presidential election to the man who had asked him the question. The Republicans took the presidency. Within a year, the South had begun to secede. The Freeport question is the canonical American example of the third move in the offensive arsenal, the commitment extraction trap. We are going to study how it works. The commitment extraction trap is a sequential game. It is structured to make the opponent's later moves dependent on the commitments they have made in their earlier moves, in such a way that no escape from the cage is available without abandoning a position the opponent cannot afford to abandon. The structure has 3 phases. The first phase is the bait. You ask a question or make a series of statements that solicits a commitment from the opponent on a point that appears innocent. The point genuinely is innocent in isolation. It is a commitment most people would make, and the opponent will make it without much resistance. Lincoln's first questions to Douglas at Freeport were of this kind, questions about whether the people of a territory should be governed in accordance with their own preferences. Douglas's popular sovereignty doctrine had been built on yes answers to these questions for years. He was not going to refuse them now. The second phase is the bank. You acknowledge the commitment, restate it in terms the opponent cannot disown, and proceed as if it were settled. This is the move most amateur trap builders skip. They ask the bait question, receive the answer, and proceed directly to the reveal, at which point the opponent has the option to retreat from the commitment they have just given. The bank prevents the retreat. By restating the commitment, by referencing it in subsequent questions, by treating it as a stable fixed point in the conversation, you make it expensive for the opponent to revise it. Each bank doubles the cost of retreat. The third phase is the reveal. You ask the question, or make the move, that depends on the banked commitment. The reveal is the moment at which the opponent realizes that their earlier innocent commitment has implications they did not foresee, and that the implications are now unavailable to them as positions to take. The reveal is, structurally, when the cage closes. Lincoln's Freeport question was a reveal that depended on commitments Douglas had banked over 5 years of public advocacy of popular sovereignty. The reveal worked because the bank was deep. Douglas could not, on the public stage, suddenly disown 5 years of his own central political doctrine. The commitment was banked too thoroughly to be repudiated in real time. The 3 phases sound mechanical. They are not. The art lies in the choice of the bait and the construction of the bank. The choice of the bait depends on 3 properties. The bait must be a commitment the opponent would be reluctant to refuse on its face. It must be a commitment whose implications, when later combined with other commitments, lead somewhere the opponent cannot defend. And it must be the kind of commitment the opponent has already given publicly elsewhere, so that refusing it now would cost more than giving it. The construction of the bank depends on language, repetition, and pacing. You restate the commitment in the opponent's words, not yours. You return to it in subsequent questions, treating it as an established premise. You do not call attention to the fact that you are banking. The bank looks from the outside like a polite recap. By the time the reveal arrives, the commitment has been referenced 3 or 4 times and has the texture of a stable platform on which the conversation has been built. Repudiating it now would require repudiating the structure of the conversation, which the opponent cannot easily do without appearing to flail. The reveal, finally, depends on having identified in advance the question that combines the banked commitments into a contradiction or an unacceptable conclusion. This identification is the preparation work that distinguishes the master trap builder from the amateur. Lincoln spent the night before the Freeport debate writing his question. He wrote it. He revised it. He read it aloud. He calibrated the language until the question was unsurvivable for Douglas. The question that arrived on the platform the next day was not improvised. It was the product of hours of construction. In Mahishmati, central India, in approximately 800 CE, Adi Shankaracharya constructed a commitment extraction trap against Mandana Misra in 3 questions on the second day of their 8-day debate. We have already seen the structure of this trap in earlier chapters. Here we will name the phases. The bait was the first question: what is moksha? This is, by any reasonable description, an innocent question. It asks Mandana to give the definition of a term both schools used. There was a standard definition. Mandana would have looked foolish refusing to give it. He gave it. Moksha is eternal, uncaused, unconditioned. The bait was taken. The commitment was on the table. The bank was the casual movement of the conversation through the next few hours, in which Shankara repeatedly referenced what we have agreed about moksha, and as you yourself have said, moksha is eternal and granted that moksha is uncaused. Each reference deepened the bank. By the third such reference, Mandana could not have repudiated the definition without appearing to flail. The definition was now an established platform. The reveal was the second question: can anything that is produced be eternal? This is also, by itself, an innocent question. It is uncontroversial. Indian philosophy. Mandana could not refuse the answer. The answer was no. Production is a process in time. A thing that is produced has a beginning. A thing with a beginning is not eternal. Mandana gave the answer. The second commitment was on the table. Then the third question, which closed the cage: if moksha is eternal and produced things are not eternal, can ritual action, which is itself a process in time, produce moksha? The answer, by Mandana's own commitments, is no. The answer is no by the definition Mandana himself gave on the first day, applied to the principle Mandana himself gave on the second. The cage is built entirely from materials Mandana has supplied. Shankara has added nothing of substance. He has simply combined the materials. Mandana spent the next 6 days attempting to escape the cage. He tried introducing intermediate causes. Ritual produces chittashuddhi, mental purification, which then produces moksha. Shankara applied the same principle. Chitta-shuddhi, being produced, is itself in time, therefore it is not moksha, it is at most a precondition. The cage closed twice. Mandana tried introducing different categories of moksha, jivan mukti, liberation while living, distinct from vaidha mukti, liberation after death. Shankara accepted the distinction and applied the same analysis to each. Neither could be produced by anything in time. The cage closed 3 times. By day 8, Mandana had conceded. The 8-day debate was structurally the playing out of a 3-question trap built on day 2. The remaining 6 days were the consequences of Mandana's failure to recognize, on day 1, that the innocent question about the definition of moksha was the bait that would close the cage. The trap was so elegant that it remains, 1200 years later, the canonical example in the Indian dialectical tradition of what should not be conceded without examining the consequences. The procedure is simple. The execution is not. The execution requires a kind of patience that most arguers, in the heat of an encounter, do not have. They want to skip from the bait to the reveal, missing the bank. They want to ask the closing question on the first turn, before the commitments have been established. They lose because the trap unbuilt closes nothing. 2 contemporary cases, briefly, to extend the example. In July 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee, the lawyer Clarence Darrow put William Jennings Bryan on the stand at the Scopes evolution trial. Darrow was defending a high school teacher accused of teaching evolution in violation of state law. Bryan, the prosecution's lead, had volunteered to testify as an expert on the Bible, an unusual move, since prosecutors typically do not testify in their own cases. Darrow asked Bryan a series of questions about specific biblical passages. The questions were innocent in isolation. Did Jonah live for 3 days inside the great fish? Did Joshua make the sun stand still? Did the great flood occur in the year 2348 BC? How was the sun made to stand still? Was the earth's rotation halted? Or was the appearance of the sun produced some other way? Each question, taken separately, Bryan answered. Each answer banked a commitment to a literal reading of a specific biblical event. By the 3rd question, Bryan had committed to the literal historicity of Jonah, Joshua, and the Genesis flood. By the 7th, he had committed to a chronology that placed the world's creation at approximately 4004 BC. By the 10th, he had committed to a literal interpretation of the days of creation in Genesis 1. Then Darrow asked, if the sun and moon were not made until the 4th day, what made it day and night during the first 3? Bryan attempted to retreat. He suggested that the days of Genesis 1 might be longer periods, perhaps geological ages. Darrow noted, courteously, that Bryan had spent the previous half-hour committing to literal interpretation of every other biblical event, and had now retreated to non-literal interpretation only when the literal interpretation produced an embarrassment. Bryan attempted to recover. He could not. The commitments had been banked too thoroughly. Bryan died 5 days after the trial ended. The verdict went against the defense on technical grounds, but the cultural verdict was the one Darrow had been seeking. The cross-examination is preserved in transcript and is taught in trial advocacy courses to this day. It is one of the most precise commitment extraction traps in the history of American law. The second case, briefer. In 1971, in New York, the lawyer Roy Cohn was deposing a witness in a real estate fraud case. The witness was an architect who had certified certain construction work as up to code. Cohn began with a series of questions about the architect's professional qualifications. Each question was innocent. You have been licensed for 15 years. You have certified hundreds of buildings. You would not certify a building you had not personally inspected. The architect answered yes to each. Cohn banked. Then Cohn produced a photograph of the building in question, taken on a date when the architect's records showed him to be in another city. The photograph showed the building with several visible code violations. You certified this building as compliant on the 17th? Yes. On the 17th, where were you? Several seconds of silence. The deposition is preserved in the trial record. It is used as a teaching example in litigation courses for the precision of its bait-bank reveal sequence. Cohn was, on most other counts, a contemptible figure. As a tactician of cross-examination he was, by the testimony of his contemporaries, among the best of his generation. The structure he used at this deposition is the same structure Lincoln used at Freeport, Darrow used at Scopes, and Shankara used at Mahishmati. The structure transfers across centuries. A note on the ethics, because this is the chapter where the question is sharpest. The commitment extraction trap, deployed against an opponent who has a defensible underlying position, exposes the inconsistencies in their stated position and forces them either to refine the position or to abandon it. This is a service to the inquiry. It is what serious philosophical and legal argument is for. The commitment extraction trap, deployed against an opponent whose underlying position is sound but whose stated formulation is imprecise, exploits the imprecision to produce a victory that does not advance the truth. Most informal conversation, most political speech, most everyday argument, these are imprecise by their nature. The trap deployed in these contexts is corrosive. A working test, again, would the trap survive the steelman? If you have constructed a trap against the strongest version of the opponent's position, the Purvapaksha version, the version the opponent themselves would endorse under ideal conditions, then the trap is exposing a real inconsistency. If the trap requires the opponent's stated formulation rather than the steelman version, the trap is exploiting imprecision rather than refuting substance, and you should not deploy it. The Freeport question survives the steelman. Lincoln's question forces an inconsistency in the strongest version of Douglas's popular sovereignty doctrine, not merely in Douglas's casual speeches. The Mandana cage survives the steelman. Shankara's three questions force an inconsistency in the strongest version of the Mimamsa position, the version Mandana would have endorsed in writing. The Scopes cross-examination is more arguable. Bryan's literalism was a sincere position, and Darrow's questions exposed real internal tensions in it. But the questions also exploited the conversational format to make the tensions look sharper than they would have looked in writing. The line is not always sharp. Practice the test. Most of the time it will tell you when to deploy and when to hold back.